Imagine walking into a first-century Roman dining room, known as a triclinium. The air is thick with the smell of roasted meat, burning oil lamps, and heavy wine. Because of this modern lens, when we read the New Testament, we tend to view the meals of Jesus and the early church as simple moments of friendship during his earthly ministry in Judea. The question is now about who his followers are willing to eat with in the real world. Why was sitting at a Gentile table the ultimate test of the cross? Because the cross did something to the invisible barriers of the ancient world that could not be undone. To understand why Paul reacted with such explosive anger in Antioch, we have to look at a physical structure standing hundreds of miles away in Jerusalem. Inside the massive complex of the Second Temple, past the dusty outer courts, stood a heavy stone barricade called the Soreg. It was roughly 5 feet high, serving as a hard physical boundary separating the inner sacred courts from the court of the Gentiles. Placed along this wall at regular intervals were large stone blocks bearing a severe warning carved in thick Greek and Latin letters. Archaeologists have actually discovered fragments of these stones. The inscription was absolute. Any foreigner who crosses this barrier will have only himself to blame for his ensuing death. This wall was not a spiritual metaphor. It was cold, immovable stone, guarded by the threat of real blood. To the conservative Jewish mind, it was the necessary boundary protecting the holiness of God from a pagan world. We assume they are merely pausing to eat between the actual, important moments of ministry. But that is a profound misunderstanding of the ancient mind. To the Gentile, it was a constant, looming monument to their permanent exclusion. When Paul writes to the Ephesian believers, he uses this exact image to explain the cosmic shockwave of the crucifixion. In Ephesians chapter 2, he writes, "For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility." Paul declares that, on the cross, Jesus did not merely negotiate a temporary religious truce between rival nations. He took a spiritual sledgehammer to the Soreg by offering his own flesh. He absorbed the hostility and abolished the ancient legal codes that demanded absolute separation. The purpose was not simply to save isolated individuals so they could go to heaven. Paul states that Jesus did this to create in himself one new humanity. This is why the early church was never just spreading a new set of intellectual beliefs. They were forming a completely new kind of society, one that actively defied the rigid categories of the Roman Empire. When a Jewish believer and a Roman believer sat down at a wooden table and tore the same loaf of bread, they were acting out a cosmic reality. Their shared meal was a public declaration that the ancient world's demand for segregation had been defeated. It was the physical proof that the dividing wall of the temple was gone. In the ancient Mediterranean world, the table was not just a piece of furniture. It was a social weapon. Now we can fully understand the weight of the Antioch crisis. If Peter refused to eat with Gentiles, he was effectively picking up the stones of the Soreg and rebuilding the wall right there in the dining room. He was telling the Gentiles that the cross was insufficient, that the blood of the Messiah had failed to make them truly equal. Up to this point in our investigation, the battle over the table has been fought across lines of ritual purity and ancient ethnicity. Jesus broke the quarantine of the religious elite, and Paul defended the inclusion of the nations. The pattern is coming into sharp focus. The gospel violently opposes the human instinct to exclude. But the story is not over. Removing ethnic and religious barriers exposed another, perhaps even deeper prejudice that still plagues us today. It is one thing to accept someone of a different background in theory. It is entirely another when the result dawned. Harsh realities of human greed, pride, and social class gather in the exact same room. The ultimate test of this. New humanity did not just happen across ethnic lines. It happened when the wealthy elite and the exhausted working class arrived at the very same door. Welcome to Corinth, a booming, status-obsessed Roman colony where wealth was the ultimate measure of a human being. It was a rigid boundary line that separated the clean from the unclean, the honorable from the shameful, the insider from the outsider. It is here that the early church faced its most insidious threat yet. The believers in Corinth did not meet in formal church buildings with rows of pews. They met in the private villas of their wealthiest members. And when they gathered to celebrate the Lord's Supper, they did not pass tiny, sterile wafers, and thimbles of juice in solemn silence. The early communion was a full, joyous, chaotic evening meal known as the agape feast, or love feast. But a severe structural problem was tearing this specific church apart. In the Roman world, time belonged to the rich. Wealthy patrons and merchants could arrive at the villa early in the afternoon. Because the host's primary dining room, the triclinium, only held about 9 to 12 reclining couches. The elite members naturally claimed the prime seats. There, they began the feast, eating the finest roasted meats and drinking the best vintages of wine. The working class, the slaves, the day laborers. The poor did not control their own time. They had to finish their exhausting shifts in the fields or the markets. By the time they finally arrived in the evening, the triclinium was full. They were forced to sit outside in the atrium, the open courtyard. By then, the best food was gone. The rich were inside getting drunk, while the poor were left outside, hungry, humiliated, and eating whatever meager scraps remained. The wealthy Corinthians probably did not think they were doing anything malicious. They were simply acting out the normal social hierarchy of the Roman Empire. Whom you shared bread with was a deeply theological act. It was a public endorsement of their life, their character, and their status before God. To them, it was just the way the world worked. But when the Apostle Paul hears about this, his response in the 11th chapter of 1 Corinthians is devastating. He writes, "When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat." Notice the absolute finality of his words. Paul does not say, "You are celebrating the Lord's Supper poorly." He does not say, "You need to improve your manners during communion." He says that because of their social division, the meal they are eating has entirely ceased to be the Lord's Supper. They are just eating an ordinary, arrogant dinner. Why? Because the bread and the cup are meant to symbolize a broken body given for everyone. When the wealthy Corinthians brought the cruel, segregating hierarchy of Rome into the church, they were openly mocking the cross. You cannot celebrate a Savior who emptied himself of all status while you are desperately clinging to your own. The Corinthians thought they could consume the holy elements of Christ while simultaneously crushing the dignity of their brothers and sisters. Paul declares this impossible. The physical bread loses its theological meaning if the community is fractured. What makes a meal the Lord's is not merely the recitation of the right prayer over the cup. This is why the religious elite of the first century were not merely annoyed by the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. It is the visible reality of the people treating one another as absolute equals. The bread must reflect the unity of the body. This severe correction from Paul is meant to wake up a sleeping, status-obsessed church. But over the centuries, his warning has been twisted. This ancient historical reality directly confronts our comfortable, modern individualism, leading us to a severe, modern misunderstanding of a very famous verse. In many modern churches, the moment before communion is the quietest part of the service. Heads bow, eyes close. A solemn piano plays softly in the background. Small trays of crushed bread and tiny plastic cups are passed down perfectly aligned rows. The atmosphere is deeply private, almost entirely internal. You can be surrounded by hundreds of people, yet feel entirely alone. During this heavy silence, a pastor will often read Paul's severe warning. Whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. Everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat. We have been trained to interpret this as a demand for intense, private introspection. We close our eyes and anxiously scan the previous week. Did I lose my temper? Did I harbor? They were violently offended by his dinner reservations. When Jesus sat down to eat with tax collectors, political traitors, a selfish thought, am I carrying unconfessed guilt? We treat the word unworthily as a measure of our personal moral perfection. We have turned the Lord's Supper into a private transaction between an isolated individual and a holy God. If the guilt feels too heavy, we let the tray pass by, fearing we are too flawed to partake. The problem is not that personal confession is wrong. The problem is that our modern definition of examining ourselves has completely stripped the table of its horizontal, human dimension. Remember the historical context of Corinth. Paul was not writing to a quiet congregation of isolated individuals worried about their private thought lives. He was writing to a noisy, chaotic, segregated dining room where wealthy Christians were actively starving the working-class believers who had just arrived from the fields. Notice the exact grammar Paul uses. He warns against eating in an unworthy manner. The Greek term is an adverb, modifying the physical action of the meal, not an adjective describing the permanent spiritual state of the eater. The crisis was not that the Corinthians had hidden private sins in their hearts. The crisis was exactly how they were eating, hoarding the best food, protecting their and those categorized by the elite as sinners. He was not simply displaying bad manners. He was actively destroying the social architecture of his world, social status, and humiliating the poor. Paul states that judgment comes upon anyone who eats without discerning the body. For centuries, Western readers have assumed the body refers exclusively to the physical flesh of Jesus on the cross, or perhaps the mystical presence within the bread itself. But Paul has already explicitly defined the body just a few chapters earlier, in this very letter. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. To fail to discern the body means to take the bread while ignoring the actual human being sitting across the room. It means swallowing the symbol of unity while maintaining social, racial, or economic division. It is the devastating hypocrisy of claiming to be united with Christ while remaining aggressively divided from his people. The wealthy Corinthians were eating unworthily because they treated the poor as invisible. Therefore, the command to examine yourself is not an invitation to spiral into private, paralyzing guilt. We look inward, but Paul was commanding them to look outward. It is a command to open your eyes, look at the physical room around you, and ask a far more difficult question: am I in right? He was taking the invisible walls that protected the holy from the profane and tearing them down over a shared cup of wine. Relationship with my brother? Am I using my wealth, politics, or status to exclude someone Jesus died to include? If communion is fundamentally about our concrete unity with others rather than our private spiritual performance, how does this judge our modern tables? The ancient historical reality directly confronts our comfortable, modern individualism. If we truly understand what was happening in Corinth, the Lord's table ceases to be a safe, quiet, religious ritual. It becomes the most subversive space on earth, every day. We operate in a world defined by hierarchy. We are constantly sorted by our income, our education, our political affiliations, Holgina, and our social influence. Our neighborhoods are segregated by property values. Our digital feeds are segregated by outrage and ideology. The world demands that we sit at the correct table, with the correct people, to prove our worth. We naturally build our own modern versions of the Roman triclinium and the Jewish soreg. But the table of Jesus is entirely flat. When you approach the bread and the cup, you leave your titles, your wealth, your voting record, and your cultural superiority at the door. At this table, the wealthy executive and the hourly laborer, the political conservative and the political progressive, the citizen and the immigrant, are exactly the same. The problem is not that we fail to recognize these meals in the Bible. The problem is that we fail to realize how dangerous they were, desperate beggars in need of grace. The ground beneath the cross is entirely level, and so is the floor beneath the table. This is not ultimately a story about a forgotten ancient ritual. It is a story about the radical, uncomfortable demand of equality. The application of this truth hits us exactly where we are most divided. Who is the person you naturally want to avoid? Who represents the modern unclean to you? Perhaps it is someone of a different political party, someone from a different socioeconomic class, or a believer whose theology frustrates you. The instinct is to separate, to withdraw to our own comfortable, safe table, exactly as Peter did in Antioch. But you cannot share the cup of Christ with someone and still treat them as an inferior. You cannot drink from the well of God's grace, while actively withholding basic human dignity from the person standing next to you. If you find yourself holding contempt for another believer, the text offers a practical mechanism for response. First, recognize the social wall you are building. Name the prejudice, the fear, or the pride honestly, without making excuses or masking it as discernment. Second, place that feeling within the larger truth of the passage. Christ let his own body be broken to tear down this exact dividing wall. Third, choose a concrete response. You may not instantly feel warm affection for someone who frustrates you, but the room is not a place of equal celebration. It is a carefully choreographed theater of human inequality. Jesus was not ultimately targeted for execution merely because of the sermons he preached. He was targeted for the people he chose to sit next to. But you can choose to speak to them with honor, to defend their dignity in public, and to refuse the cultural instinct to mock them. Finally, release the result to God, and repeat this practice every time the pride flares up again. The table forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What are you trying to protect when you refuse to sit with those you consider other? The pressure of the table reveals the hidden hierarchies we still worship. By sharing the bread, we are making a radical, physical claim that our allegiance to the family of Jesus supersedes every other earthly identity. We are declaring that the kingdom of God is not divided by the boundary lines of the world, but there is one final horizon to this story, an image that gives the table its ultimate meaning. The meal we eat today is not just a memorial looking backward to the cross, to see what this demands of us today. We must look at where this table is ultimately headed. Step back and look at the vast architecture of the story. From the crowded, controversial living rooms of Judea, to the tense, segregated house churches of Antioch, to the wealthy, status-obsessed villas of Corinth, we have seen how the simple act of eating threatened to tear the ancient world apart. The table has always been the dangerous battleground where the gospel is forced out of abstract theological theory and tested in the physical reality of human relationships. This raises a startling question. Why did the simple act of eating a meal cause the greatest scandals, conflicts, and divisions in the early church? But when Jesus broke the bread on the night he was betrayed, he did not just look backward. He added a specific, unbreakable promise. He handed the cup to his disciples and said, "I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day, when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." The Lord's Supper is not merely a solemn memorial of a historical sacrifice. It is a prophetic rehearsal. In the book of Revelation, the final climax of human history does not end with a disembodied, silent choir floating in the clouds. It ends with a meal. John's vision culminates in the marriage supper of the Lamb. The ultimate destination of the universe is a massive, joyous, physical banquet where men and women from every tribe, tongue, nation, and social class are seated together in perfect, unbreakable peace. This changes everything about what we are doing on a Sunday morning. Table fellowship is not a forgotten ancient ritual, and it is certainly not a private moment of individual introspection. It is an appointed meeting with the future. Every time a fractured, politically divided, socially diverse group of sinners gathers around the communion table and treats one another as absolute equals, they are dragging the future kingdom of God into the present tense. They are acting out the end of the world before it happens. Think back to that first-century Roman triclinium we entered at the beginning. Why did the Apostle Paul later publicly condemn the Apostle Peter not over a complex piece of abstract theology? Remember the heavy, suffocating anxiety of that room, the constant need to protect your status, the fear of sitting in the wrong seat, the cushioned couches reserved for the powerful, and the rigid wooden benches assigned to the poor. At the Messianic banquet, that room is completely dismantled. The couches of the elite are gone. The benches of the marginalized are gone. The stone warning blocks of the temple have been reduced to dust. The exhausting human obsession with ranking, sorting, and separating each other is finally over. This is not ultimately a story about hospitality, nutrition, or ancient table manners. It has always been a story about the radical, unstoppable grace of God dismantling human pride in order to build an entirely new family. When you take the bread, you are publicly declaring that your worth is not defined by your wealth, your politics, or your flawless purity, but entirely by the blood of the host who invited you. At the end of all things, you will not sit in isolated, private perfection. You will take your seat at the longest table in the cosmos, look across the bread, and realize you are sitting right next to your former enemy, and you will both be entirely clean. But over Peter's decision to change his seat at dinner, this is not ultimately a story about hunger and hospitality. It is a story about status, purity, and the radical redefinition of God's family. The dining table is the battleground, where the gospel is either proven or betrayed. To understand why a dinner invitation could shake the foundations of the ancient world, we have to look closer at the invisible lines drawn across every table in Judea. The invisible lines in Judea were drawn with water and stone. For a strict first-century sect like the Pharisees, the dining table was not a secular space. It was a holy altar. Their movement was originally born from a beautiful, even noble idea. Holiness should not be confined to the massive stone walls of the temple in Jerusalem. They believed that every Jewish home could be a sanctuary, every daily meal an act of worship, and every father. The host reclines on the highest, most cushioned couch. To his right sit the wealthy, the educated, and the powerful, those who can offer political favors in return. A priest in his own house. To achieve this, they brought the rigorous, exhausting purity laws of the temple priests into the everyday dining room. Before a single piece of bread could be broken, hands had to be ritually washed. Imagine the sound of cold water pouring from a stone jar over the hands, the careful scrubbing of skin up to the wrist, the strict inspection of bowls and cups. This was not about physical hygiene or avoiding bacteria, which they knew nothing about. It was about spiritual quarantine. Israel carried the deep trauma of historical exile. They believed that breaking God's laws had cost them their nation once before. Now, living under brutal Roman occupation, the Pharisees believed that strict obedience was the only way to invite God's presence back. The dining table became their defense line against the pagan world. But this system relied on a terrifying principle. In the ancient Jewish mindset, ritual impurity was highly contagious. It operated exactly like a virus. If a person who was ritually unclean touched a clay pot, the pot immediately became unclean. If a righteous man shared a loaf of bread or drank from the same cup as a sinner, someone whose lifestyle defied the covenant, like a tax collector working for Rome, the sinner's spiritual impurity transferred directly to the righteous man. Purity flowed in only one direction. The clean could not make the unclean clean. The unclean could only pollute the clean. A single drop of ink ruins a glass. They are served the finest cuts of meat and the oldest vintage. But as your eyes move further down the room, the reality shifts of pure water. But a drop of pure water does nothing to cleanse a glass of ink. This is why the religious elite reacted with such visceral horror in the Gospels when Jesus reclined at a table surrounded by outcasts, extortionists, and women of the street. The Pharisees did not merely think he was making a poor public relations choice. They believed he was actively infecting himself with spiritual death. To their eyes, a rabbi who willingly sat in a room of contagion was either a completely ignorant fraud who did not understand the law, or a dangerous rebel deliberately mocking the holiness of God. The problem is not that the religious leaders were cruel. The problem is that their theology left no room for rescue If a person fell into the category of sinner, they were socially and spiritually quarantined. The physical isolation was absolute. Jesus could have preached to these marginalized people in the streets at a safe distance, and then retreated to dine safely with the pure. Instead, he made the dining table his primary weapon of grace. But one detail still refuses to fit. If the law of contagion was universally accepted, and everyone knew that, eating with a sinner made you unclean, what was Jesus actually doing when he broke the bread? If sin is contagious at the table, what happens when the guest is God himself? To understand exactly what occurred in those dining rooms, we have to look closely at the text. The lower class guests, the laborers, and the freedmen do not recline. They sit on rigid wooden benches near the door. Brings us to a specific Greek word that changes everything about how Jesus interacted with the marginalized. In the modern West, we eat at a polite distance. We sit upright in individual chairs, separated by a wide wooden surface, eating from individual, carefully portioned plates. But the ancient Mediterranean world ate differently. And to understand the scandal of the Gospels, we must feel the physical reality of their meals. Picture a low table, barely a foot off the floor. There are no chairs, only cushions or thick carpets. Guests did not sit upright. They reclined on their left sides, resting their weight on their left elbows, with their feet stretched out behind them, away from the food. The Gospel writers use a specific Greek word to describe this posture: sunanakemai, sonanakei. The translation is accurate when it says to eat with or recline together at table, but the English phrase loses the profound physical intimacy of the original term. Because everyone was reclining closely in a circle, the head of one guest was often resting near the chest of the person beside them. There were no individual plates or personal silverware. Everyone reached their bare hands into a single, shared earthen bowl. They tore pieces from the exact same loaf of bread. They are served cheap, diluted wine, and inferior bread. They are literally watching the wealthy eat better food in the same room. They dipped their food into the same common oil or broth. To share a meal in this posture meant sharing your literal breath, your space, and your sustenance with another human being. It was the ultimate ancient symbol of family, mutual trust, and total acceptance. Now imagine the horror of the Pharisees standing in the doorway of a house belonging to Levi, a Roman tax collector. They see Jesus of Nazareth engaging in sunanakemai with extortionists, political traitors, and the socially discarded. They watch Jesus reach his hand into the same bowl as a man who robs his own people for Rome. According to the strict map of purity, the moment Jesus swallowed that shared food, the spiritual contamination of the room entered his own body. They believed Jesus was voluntarily rendering himself unclean. But they misunderstood the nature of the man at the center of the room. Jesus was not ignoring the reality of purity. He was completely reversing the flow of contagion. Under the old system, impurity was contagious, and holiness was fragile. You had to protect the holy from the profane by building walls and performing rigorous washing rituals. But Jesus introduced a completely new spiritual physics to the world. Just as he could reach out and touch a man covered in leprosy, in this world, where you sit, what you are served, and who you eat with is never an accident. And instead of catching the disease, the leper caught his healing. The same dynamic occurred at dinner. Jesus reversed the arrow. He did not absorb their sin. They absorbed his grace. His holiness was not a fragile glass that shattered upon contact with the broken. It was a blazing fire that purified everything it touched. By sharing the bowl with the marginalized, Jesus proved that the grace of God is overwhelmingly aggressive. It does not wait safely behind temple walls for people to clean themselves up. It enters the deeply contaminated spaces of human failure and cleanses them from the inside out. In a single meal, Jesus transformed the dining table from a place of strict quarantine into a place of profound healing. That would already be significant if the story ended there. But this radical acceptance was only the first earthquake. The early Jewish disciples eventually accepted that Jesus could eat with Jewish sinners. But the second earthquake would threaten to tear the early church apart entirely, decades later. The controversy over the table moved out of Jerusalem and into the Gentile world. Imagine the bustling, cosmopolitan city of Antioch, decades after the resurrection. Inside, a crowded house church, a revolutionary scene is unfolding. Jewish and Gentile believers are sitting at the exact same table, sharing the exact same bread. For centuries, this image was culturally impossible. It is a public declaration of exactly how much your life is worth. Today, when we think about a dining table, to a first-century Jew, Gentile homes were ritually unclean. Their meat might have been sacrificed to pagan idols. Their cooking pots were defiled, and their very presence was a violation of strict ethnic boundaries. A faithful Jew would rather go hungry than compromise their purity by eating at a Gentile table. Yet, sitting right in the middle of this mixed group is Peter, the leading apostle of the early church. He is freely engaging in sunanakimai with uncircumcised Romans and Greeks. He is eating their food, sharing their cups, and treating them as equal members of God's family. The gospel has finally conquered the ancient prejudices of the Mediterranean world. But then, the atmosphere in the room suddenly shifts. A group of conservative Jewish believers, men sent from James in Jerusalem, walks through the door. These men still hold tightly to the ancient dietary laws and the rigid boundaries of the Old Covenant. As they enter, the social pressure in the room becomes suffocating. Watch Peter's reaction. The Apostle Paul records exactly what happens next in the second chapter of Galatians. Under the intense, burning gaze of his conservative peers, Peter quietly stops eating. He stands up, separates himself from the Gentile believers, and moves over to a culturally safe, Jewish-only table. The social ripple effect is immediate and devastating. Seeing the great Apostle Peter withdraw, the other Jewish believers immediately abandon the Gentiles as well. We picture a place of warmth, casual hospitality, and family. We invite people over for dinner simply because we enjoy their company. Even Barnabas, Paul's trusted missionary partner, is swept away by the hypocrisy. In a matter of minutes, the beautiful, unified table of Christ is shattered. The room is once again rigidly segregated by race, religious background, and ritual purity. Imagine being a Roman or Greek believer left sitting at that abandoned table. The silent message was loud and clear. You are accepted by Jesus, but you are still not clean enough to eat with us. You are second-class citizens in the kingdom. When Paul sees this, he is furious. He does not pull Peter aside for a quiet, diplomatic conversation about cultural sensitivity. He confronts Peter publicly, to his face, in front of the entire church. But notice carefully what Paul actually says. He does not accuse Peter of having bad manners. He does not say, "Peter, you are hurting their feelings," or "you are being an ungracious guest." He says that Peter is not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. This is a stunning escalation. Paul elevates a simple seating arrangement to a matter of eternal salvation. By moving his seat, Peter was quietly rebuilding the very walls of hostility that Jesus had died to tear down. He was visually preaching a false gospel, a counterfeit message that said the blood of Jesus was enough to save you, but you still needed Jewish cultural purity to truly belong at the family table. The central problem is no longer just about who Jesus ate with.